So now we're going to go into like some features in Docker, and these are kind of like, I'm going to just like show you the door down to multiple different pathways, and you're welcome to like peek in and you can go deeper into these topics, right? Like for example, networking, that's a real deep rabbit hole that again, I'm not particularly qualified to talk to you about, but I'm just going to show you like how to do the basics of networking, and then from there you can go and learn more about it. So the first one is, these are relatively similar topics, bind mounts and volumes, but they accomplish relatively different results, let's go with. The idea is that you have some sort of like persistent storage between runs, right? So if I have like this container and it does a bunch of stuff and then outputs it to this bind mount, or let's go our volume, and then I go run that container again, that state will still be there, right? We need some way that we can have this like state maintained between runs of containers, right? Because when containers get closed, they drop off everything that they had before, right? So far we've been dealing with self-contained containers. This is normally like, this is all you ever want. It's just a container that's totally self-contained that runs, does something, and disappears, right? And a big key about this is that we don't want to have what we call snowflakes. A snowflake is like some special server that you have out running on your like production servers, and you've just massaged it, and it's like this bespoke artisanal server that has like all the proper versions and everything's working correctly. If it just goes away, like your entire system can come down, right? And what happens if that happens, right? Then you have to go back and you have to go recreate all those various different sets to figure out like how you got there. And that's problematic, right? Because we don't want that necessarily to happen, right? Like we don't want to be subjugated to this like bespoke Snowflake server. So that's why containers are great, because you can spin them up and you can close them down. You can spin them up and you can close them down, and that's kind of like the appeal here of containers. So we're trying to avoid snowflakes. Like there's the idea of like you don't want snowflakes and you want what are called people call cattle, right? And I swear to God, this is not my analogy, but the idea is that you have many cattle and one cow is not any different than the other cow, right? So you just want to have everything is just exactly the same, and you can swap them out and you can replace them and everything else, and that's just fine. I will go no further into that metaphor, but that's what people say. Okay. However, not everything can fit neatly into a container all the time, and a really good example of this is databases, right? So I can spin up and down my SQL databases, right? And it's fine that I have various different like clients or servers of that, right? But the core data needs to be preserved between runs, right? So if I scale up my database and now I have 100 containers running and then I scale down to 10, I don't want to lose that data. That's the important part, right? So that's why we're going to get into things called mounts, right? And the two different kind of mounts that we're going to talk about today, and I think there's 4 or 5 different types, but the two primary useful ones are going to be bind mounts and volume mounts. So bind mounts are like portals to your host computer, right? So I can say like, okay, here's this folder, and this container can see just this folder, right? And we're going to mount it in this one particular place, and it's bound, right? So if anything the container changes shows up on the host computer, and anything the host computer changes ends up in the container, right? They're bound together, okay? This can be really useful for things like developer containers, right? So if I'm writing code, it needs to execute in a specific kind of container or like environment, this is really useful for that, right? Like for example, like I don't have Go installed on my computer, but if I wanted to develop a Go project or run a Go project, right? I could do that with a container and use a bind mount so that anytime I modify the code, it modifies the code inside of the container. So that's where bind mounts are going to be useful. So I'm going to show you how to do this really quickly here with this particular command right here, which you can copy and paste directly off of my notes here. So let's clear. So I'm inside of my, again, static assets project, the one that you just built, right? And I'm going to do docker run -- mount right here, right? And then I'm going to do a type equals bind. So this is a bind mount, not a volume mount. You're going to say the source, and this is this PWD. You have to give it a full path, an absolute path as it's called, right? And I don't want to type out all of it, so you can do this trick right here, which is quotation marks and then $PWD is like output where I am right now. That's what this does. or you could just put the whole qualified path if you want to do that. /build, which is the part that I already built out, right? And then target, this is where I want it to output within the container, right? So this outputs to the user share nginx HTML. That should look familiar to you, right? Because that's where we output the build process. And then we're publishing on port 8080, and we're going to run nginx, and let's just put in 1.17 so that we can be running on a consistent version, okay? So what do you expect to happen now? I'm actually going to be running the nginx container directly, right? I'm not building anything on top of it, but we're going to accomplish the same thing, right? It's still going to work the exact same way. So now that we've done that, this starts up. And now we can still go to 8080, right? So 8080. And look, it's still running, right? It's running directly from nginx. It's not running from our built container. It's running from nginx, right? But we used a bind mount to mount like basically a portal from our file system here and putting that into nginx. So we'll do more examples of this, but that's like the base of what bind mounts are. So this is reading directly out of my Mac to serve this up in the container. Does it make sense?
The build folder is not in the container. It's just sitting like a regular folder, and then the container is actually nginx. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go grab that static folder and I'm gonna serve it.
Right, because I basically tunneled between my Mac and the inside of the container.
So there's no Docker file involved.
There's no additional Docker file involved. Correct. Yeah, we're just running the nginx container directly off of Docker Hub with no changes. Magic. So that's what bind mounts can be useful for, is we can mount in stuff like that, right? Now, would I do this in production versus building my own container? No, I would still build a container, because if I build that container, it's totally self-contained. I can throw it anywhere. I can put it on Azure. I can put it on AWS. I can say just execute that container. I don't have to set it up any more than that. It just runs the container and it just works, right? Whereas if I try and accomplish this, I have to like, okay, well, bind mount this is here, and you have to read it from this place and a bunch of stuff like that. It's a bit more snowflakey for that, to use our previous terminology. So does that make sense? Does it make sense what bind volumes are doing, right? So again, this is quite useful for things like development environments. Oh, and that was the last thing I was going to mention, is you can mount that file to etc nginx nginx.conf if you want to modify the configuration. You could use another bind mount to modify the configuration of nginx, and that would totally work as well. To the operating system, like to the container, it cannot tell the difference between a bind mount and just normal files there, right? It just shows up to that container as if it was normally mounted into that file system, which is pretty cool. So again, like I imagine many of you have started at like new development jobs, and when you walk in, the first thing they do is they hand you a README that's like probably about 6 months out of date, right? And then you have to go and figure out how to set up this development environment step by step, and things break, and you have to go ask the senior developer, how do I do this? It's like, oh, fine, do this, right? Or no one knows. Like that's the even worse thing, right? I've been there. I imagine many of you have been there. So that's where bind mounts and containers can come together and be very useful to you, right? Because they can just hand you a container. So like, here, this container has everything that you need to get started. Just bind mount your code into this particular area, say run container, and you have this development environment that someone else has already set up for you, and you can just start coding away and it works on day one. That's kind of the promise of development environments with containers. And not next section, but the section after that will show you how to do that.